-40 degrees. Frostbite in 90 seconds. Death in minutes. And 28 men had been living in it, sleeping in it, surviving in it for over a year. Their ship was already gone, crushed by Antarctic ice and swallowed by the ocean while they watched, standing on a floating sheet of ice, unable to do anything, unable to stop it. No rescue was coming. Nobody on Earth knew where they were. The nearest living person over 1,000 miles away. And Shackleton knew something else, something he did not tell his men. No ship would ever find them here. Not because nobody cared, because nobody knew. Because Elephant Island was so far outside every known shipping route, so completely removed from any path any vessel would ever take, that they could stand on that beach and wave and scream for the rest of their lives and never be seen. So he made a decision. He took 5 men, a lifeboat 22 feet long, and he pointed it at South Georgia Island, 800 miles away, across the most violent ocean on Earth, through waves 50 feet high, through spray that froze to their faces mid-air, through 16 days of conditions that had killed better ships than theirs, because staying was a slower way to die. This is a true survival story. Ernest Shackleton was 40 years old in 1914, an Irish-born British explorer who had already been to Antarctica twice, who had come within 97 miles of the South Pole in 1909 before turning back, a decision that cost him the glory but saved his life. He was not a man built for turning back. That decision haunted him for years. By 1914, the South Pole had been reached, first by Amundsen, then by Robert Falcon Scott, who arrived a month later and died on the return journey with his entire team. The race that had defined a generation of exploration was over. Shackleton needed something new, something no one had done. He found it in crossing Antarctica entirely, from the Weddell Sea on one side, through the South Pole to the Ross Sea on the other, nearly 1,800 miles across the most unforgiving continent on the planet. No one had done it. No one had seriously attempted it. He placed an advertisement in London newspapers. Men wanted for hazardous journey, small wages, bitter cold, long months of complete darkness, constant danger, safe return doubtful. Thousands applied. He selected 27 men, scientists, sailors, a photographer, a carpenter, a cook, men who understood, at least in the abstract, what they were agreeing to. On August 1, 1914, the same week the First World War began, the Endurance sailed from London. Half the world was heading toward the trenches. Shackleton was heading toward ice. The Endurance was built in Norway specifically for polar work, reinforced wood several feet thick at the bow, internal beams cross-braced to distribute the pressure of pack ice rather than absorb it at a single point. Her name came from Shackleton's family motto, "By endurance we conquer." He believed in the ship completely. They reached South Georgia Island in November 1914, the last inhabited stop before Antarctica. Norwegian whalers gave Shackleton a warning that men who knew this ocean did not give lightly. The sea ice that year was the worst in living memory, thicker, further north, moving in patterns that suggested a Weddell Sea more heavily consolidated than any recent winter. Shackleton listened, then sailed south anyway. January 1915, the Weddell Sea. Pack ice appeared first as scattered floes on the horizon, white shapes in gray ocean, unremarkable at distance. The Endurance pushed through them the way she was built to, the reinforced bow cracking ice apart beneath her weight, broken pieces grinding along the hull and disappearing in her wake. Then the ice thickened. The gaps between floes narrowed, passages closed behind the ship as new ice formed faster than the engines could push through it. On January 19, 1915, the Endurance stopped. The ice around her had consolidated into a single mass extending in every direction. Full engine power forward accomplished nothing. Men went out with hand saws and cut channels that refroze within hours. The ice did not respond to effort. It did not respond to desperation. It held. And then, slowly, without sound at first, the ship began to move. Not by her own power. The pack ice was carrying her northwest, away from Antarctica, away from the mission, drifting on currents deep beneath the surface in directions that had nothing to do with where 28 men needed to go. Shackleton converted the ship to winter quarters, established routines. The men hunted seals on the ice, staged theatrical performances for each other, named the sled dogs. They maintained, through deliberate effort, something resembling normalcy in conditions that had no right to contain it. The polar winter closed around them. The sun disappeared for months. Temperatures dropped to -30, -40. Storms confined the men to their tents for days, the wind making standing upright outside impossible. Sleeping bags froze damp and stayed that way. Clothing never dried. Boots froze stiff within minutes of removal. They waited. For 10 months, they waited. Then the sounds began. It started as vibration felt in the feet before heard by the ears. Then the groaning, deep and structural, the sound of something being compressed beyond what it was built to absorb. The ice that winter was too thick, too consolidated, moving with too much force. Rather than lifting the Endurance upward as designed, it held her fast and squeezed from both sides simultaneously. The hull planking buckled inward. Below decks, the cross-bracing beams cracked one by one, the sounds moving through the ship like something methodically destroying itself from the inside. Water came in, first as seepage the pumps could manage, then faster still, until men rotated through pump duty around the clock, fighting water arriving faster than it was leaving. The carpenter worked continuously, reinforcing bulkheads, sleeping in intervals of minutes. The deck warped, the masts tilted. Everyone understood what was happening. Nobody said it out loud. On October 27, 1915, Shackleton gathered the crew. No speech, no false reassurance. He said simply, "It is time to get off the ship." They pulled 3 lifeboats onto the ice, salvaged food and equipment, set up camp, turned to watch. The Endurance lasted a few more weeks, held partially upright, her masts still visible. Then, on November 21, the ice released her. She went down quietly. 28 men stood on floating ice in -30 degrees and watched their only way home disappear beneath the surface. The silence that followed was absolute. And Shackleton looked at every one of them and made a promise he had no logical right to make. Every single one of you is going home. No ship, no rescue. Antarctic winter, 1,000 miles from anywhere. And Shackleton sitting alone in his tent that night, knowing something he had not said out loud, knowing that no ship would ever come looking for them here, knowing that if they stayed on Elephant Island, they were not waiting for rescue. They were waiting to die. He established order immediately. Tent assignments, meal rotations, work schedules. Shackleton understood that the line between a functioning crew and 28 men dissolving into individual desperation is maintained not by authority, but by occupation and trust. He redistributed the warmest sleeping bags by lottery, making sure he received one of the coldest. He assigned officers to menial work alongside ordinary sailors. He moved between tents in the evenings, talking, listening, monitoring the psychological temperature of his crew with the same attention he gave their physical survival. The conditions were a sustained assault on every system the human body possesses. Sleeping bags were perpetually damp, moisture from breathing freezing on tent surfaces and falling as ice crystals onto everything beneath. Clothing never fully dried. The storms that came without warning confined men to tents for days. Canvas walls shuddering in winds that reduced visibility to nothing and made the outside air feel less like weather and more like a physical force with specific intentions. They ate seal meat, raw when it had to be, cooked when fuel allowed. They melted ice for water because there was no other source. They rationed everything with the particular discipline of people who have done the mathematics and understand exactly how little margin they have. The ice drifted north, slowly but measurably. Shackleton tracked their position, watching the drift, calculating. The ice was moving them toward open water, which meant it was breaking up, which meant the floe beneath them would eventually fracture. On April 9, 1916, 5 months after the Endurance sank, the ice cracked enough to launch the boats. And what came next was the most dangerous week of the entire expedition.
The Southern Ocean does not behave like other oceans. The winds that circle Antarctica unobstructed build waves over thousands of miles of open fetch that reach heights no other ocean routinely produces. 40 feet, 50 feet, walls of gray water moving with the accumulated momentum of a planet's worth of wind behind them. The largest lifeboat was 22 feet long. 7 days, 3 boats, conditions that reduced survival to its absolute minimum. The boats were bailed without pause. A man stopping too long risked the boat swamping beyond recovery. Spray froze to oars, to clothing, to the faces of the men pulling, building in layers that had to be chipped off because the weight would alter the boat's stability. Frostbite attacked fingers and toes through gloves and boots that could not be kept dry. Men who fell unconscious were shaken awake immediately because unconsciousness in those temperatures was the first stage of dying. On April 15, 1916, land appeared. Elephant Island. The first solid ground in 497 days. Men fell to their knees on the beach. One picked up a handful of stones and simply held them. Another sat at the water's edge and laughed until he could not breathe. They were alive. They were on land. And Shackleton knew, standing on that beach, that land was not enough. He had already done the calculation in his head during those 7 days on the water. Elephant Island sat completely outside every shipping lane in the Southern Ocean. No vessel had any reason to pass near it. No rescue party would know to look there. The world, as it knew, had lost the Endurance and her crew somewhere in the Weddell Sea. Nobody was coming. Not in weeks, not in months, not ever. If they stayed, they would die warm enough. They would die with ground under their feet instead of ice.
But they would die. The supplies would run out, the Antarctic winter would close in again, and 28 men would simply disappear from the earth on an island nobody visited. Shackleton looked at the ocean. He looked at the James Caird, 22 feet long, a lifeboat that had just survived 7 days of the Southern Ocean, battered and leaking, and nowhere near designed for what he was about to ask of it. Then he looked at his men, and he made the only decision that gave any of them a chance. Even though every experienced sailor alive would have told him it was not survivable. He told his men he was going for help. What he did not tell them was that the sailors who knew this ocean best, the whalers at South Georgia, the men who had spent their lives reading these waters, had said privately and clearly that an open boat crossing of the Southern Ocean could not be done. Shackleton heard this. He went anyway. On April 24, 1916, the James C. Caird left Elephant Island. The 22 men remaining watched it disappear. Some later said that was the worst moment of the entire expedition. Not the sinking, not the months on the ice, but watching that small boat vanish into the Southern Ocean, knowing that if it did not make it, every man on that beach was already dead. They just did not know it yet. 16 days, open ocean. No description has ever fully captured what those 16 days contained. Worsley navigated, taking sun sightings through cloud cover on a pitching deck with frozen hands, calculating position across 800 miles of featureless water, where deviation of a few degrees meant missing South Georgia entirely and sailing into empty ocean until the food ran out and the men simply stopped. The waves were the largest Shackleton had encountered in a lifetime at sea. Ice formed on the deck covering and had to be chipped off in complete darkness to prevent the weight from capsizing them. Sleeping bags froze solid. Hot food was cold before it reached the mouth. There were moments, in the darkness, in the largest waves, when the men could not see the other end of their own boat. There were moments when survival felt less like a plan and more like a direction they were still moving in, despite everything. On May 8, 1916, South Georgia appeared on the horizon. Worsley's navigation across 800 miles of the most difficult ocean on Earth had been accurate to within miles. But they had landed on the wrong side of the island. The whaling station was on the opposite coast. Between them, an unmapped mountain range no one had ever crossed. They had survived the ocean, now the mountains. 3 men were too exhausted to move. Shackleton left them and took Worsley and Tom Crean into the unmapped interior. 36 hours without sleep. No useful map, no equipment designed for glaciated terrain. Crevasses hidden beneath snow, ridges requiring descent in complete darkness. Cold that made stopping for more than minutes dangerous to bodies running on months of inadequate nutrition. At one point, facing a steep glacier descent in complete darkness with no way to see what was below, Shackleton made a decision. They coiled their rope, sat together, and slid into the dark, accelerating, unable to see, unable to stop. It ended in flat ground. They arrived at Stromness Whaling Station on May 20th, 1916. 3 men, blackened and unrecognizable, walked in and asked for the manager. Matthias Anderson looked at them for a long moment, asked who they were. Shackleton told him. Anderson turned away and wept. 3 rescue attempts failed, ice blocking the approach each time. On the 4th attempt, August 30th, 1916, the ship broke through. The men on Elephant Island had been waiting 4 months and 15 days, living under 2 upturned lifeboats, surviving on seal and penguin. Every single morning, without exception, Frank Wilde had packed his belongings before breakfast, so the men would be ready, in case today was the day. When the rescue ship appeared, men ran to the shore, some crying, some laughing, some unable to do either. Shackleton stood at the rail and counted every man as he came from shore. When he reached 22, he turned to the captain beside him. "They're all safe," he said, "every one." The expedition had lasted nearly 2 years. The ship was destroyed. Antarctica was never crossed. By every conventional measure, it had failed completely. 28 men entered the Antarctic. 28 men came home. He had promised every man would go home. And standing at that rail, counting every face, he kept that promise. So here is the only question. When staying feels safer than going, and going feels impossible, which one do you choose?